All right, so something I'm going to start doing is taking requests from either the comments section or by email, where if you send me an example or inspiration that you want to learn how to model, I'll start putting together a list and begin uh, doing tutorials on that as well. So here's an example that was sent to me looking at how to do this treehouse restaurant design. So you can see that it's got this really kind of nice outer skeleton structure that's ribbed and spiraling around this. So that's what we're going to focus on in this tutorial is how do you get to that form, right? This kind of idea of it kind of blowing up in the center. This example is showing how it starts at one size and as it wraps around, it starts to get wider. I'll show you some other iterations where maybe you don't want to wrap it around all the way, or maybe you want to keep it the same dimension throughout. Those are also very viable options. So that's what the focus is for this. Obviously, other things that need to be considered are a lot of the kind of interior details, such as railings, uh, accessibility. So, do you take a spiral staircase around the trunk of this tree to get up there and take advantage of that? Or, like in the example shown, is it this kind of drawbridge that goes off into the distance to another location? So, those can be covered in other videos, but for this, we'll just focus on getting to this output. So you can see what's nice is that it is a pretty simple script. A lot of it gets a little more comprehensive when you start to add all the dimension and thickness to things. So like I said, it's really nice in terms of its simplicity in the script itself. So let's go ahead and get started. So again, I'll start from scratch. I'll hide our tree trunk reference here. And what's good about this too is that you can start with a given point, or if you want, you can even just uh, start it directly from Grasshopper. You don't even need to actually physically have a reference in Rhino. So we'll start that way. So I'm going to literally just construct a point, and I want to create a series of points in the Z direction. So I'll go to Sets, Sequence, and use the Series component. I'll keep the step size at 1. Obviously, you can make that more dense or less. It doesn't really matter. But I'm also going to have at least 30 of these points. And then I can also adjust how high I want this off the ground. So I can use this to start at 15 feet in the air. I can have it start lower, actually on grade. I can have it go even higher up, but we'll just keep it around that range for now. So from here, I can start to mess with that profile, and that's what those graph mappers do. So I'm going to create a range of values. I'm going to use the same, the count for this one. I also want to use the same number in this. And I'll keep the domain of 0 to 1 because that's just the default for the graph mapper. So it's one less thing to have to adjust with that. But you will see that even though I'm entering 20 steps, same here, it's actually including the 0 value. So you get 31 values for that. So we want to just give it a simple expression of x minus 1. So that way we have 30 values there, 30 values there, which is the same, and that's what we want to maintain. So the next thing I'm going to do, go to my parameters and use the graph mapper here. And this is where we get to determine the profile of our structure. So I'm going to go to my graph type, and for this I'm going to use the Gaussian. You can obviously use the different types of graph mappers to get this, but this will start to dictate our profile. And the way you can kind of think of this is kind of a sideways profile of it. So I'm going to make it a little bit more pitched, make it look a little more like that maybe. And by keeping this in the center, that means the bottom point and the top point will end at the same direction. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump to that part before I mess with this anymore. So I'm going to move these points just in the x direction. So really simple that way. And I'm actually going to also give this a multiplier because I don't want to stick with just the 0 to 1. I also don't want to have to constantly click in here and change it that way. So I'm just going to give myself a slider between 6 and 15 for now. And I'm going to bring it to around 9. So this is the values I'll get. Do it that way. Now we can, like I said, start to see our profile a little bit better that way. And again, like I said, you can always adjust this if you want it to be a little more accentuated. You can start to do it like that. You can even enhance it more with your multiplier. Um, you can make it a little bit more subtle as well. You can kind of mess away with that so that, again, you don't have a lot of change. But I'm going to keep it somewhat distinct and have some nice profile to it. So that looks pretty good. The next thing I want to do in order to kind of get that spiraling condition, I want to also kind of make these incrementally get wider with each step size. So I'm going to take these now too. And what's good, I can just use this same kind of part here. I'm actually just going to select these two and copy and paste it. And I'm also going to use the multiplier. But instead of using a single value, I'm actually going to use a range of values for each one of these. So that way each one incrementally gets bigger instead of them all just going the same distance. So I'm going to, again, use a range component. And for this, I can basically just utilize the same number as what I'm using here. So I'm going to, again, kind of go ahead and drag that into there. Again, give it that expression of x minus 1. And I get to determine how much further do I want it to go out. So I'm going to just keep this like that. And I don't need to have this as kind of accentuated as the last one, so I can keep it a little more subdued. I can put this into here, and what I want to do is make sure that basically I'm going to create 30 intervals coming out, so 30 increments based off of this. If I want, I could obviously always have more. I'm actually going to create a separate slider for that, so in this case I'm going to have 35. And I'm going to graph that. So what this is going to do is basically say I'm going to have 35 different iterations that slightly change. And you'll see when I move this, again in the x direction, but using this new value, now you'll see that each one kind of incrementally gets wider. And this, the number of points is defined with this one. So if I want there to be more points, I do it like that. Basically, we are going to want to use the same slider for something else too coming up. But you can basically see that these start off really close together, so there's not a lot of change. It's only in that center, which is kind of like that too. And if you want, you can even get them to not move much at all at the bottom, but really start to change over there, which is kind of cool. It's interesting too, if you even begin to offset that, you'll see again like how you can have some really interesting profile curves when you start to get this all working together. So from here, this is the fun part. This is where we get to have it actually circle around our tree trunk. So I'll go ahead and turn this off. And now I want to rotate these points. So I want to make sure I can obviously use that same plane. It doesn't really matter where it's at, but I do want to change this degrees. And I do want to, again, create a range of values between 0 and around 350. So I'm going to use range. I'm going to go again from 0 to 350, and I'll try to do something like 180 less than 350. So that way I don't go too much further off. And this is where, again, I want to use the same increments as that one. So, and again, I have to make sure this is giving me 31. This one's giving me, you can see in this number 30. So again, I want to just give this, once again, an expression of x minus 1. And so here's my, that way those are the same. I am going to bump that up to 350 for now. And I also want to, if I just drag that in there, you'll see that it doesn't exactly do what we want. It is kind of cool still. Um, I actually really kind of like that, but it's not exactly what we need for this. So I'm going to go ahead and graph this as well. And I'll turn this one off. And now we can see that each kind of grouping of profiles, those ones that we kind of had extruding out of here, like we can see it here, each one of these rotates in that same kind of order. So as it goes from the very first profile to the end one, they get wider and wider. Um, and from here, just to kind of help see it a little bit better, I'm going to go ahead and use this interpolated curve and turn these points off. And you can start to see the kind of the wireframe of our structure right now. And like I said, you can start to have a lot of fun with what that profile looks like by either kind of shifting this one around so that it even kind of starts at that point and then ends up at a higher area, which is really kind of cool and interesting. Or you can kind of just have it go lower, but you start to have a lot of kind of interesting interactions between those. Okay, so again, we don't want to just end with a wireframe example. We want to start to give this dimension. So this really kind of gets us to our structure. Obviously, we can again kind of continue to extend and change iterations of these. Always increase if we want there to be more of these ribs. We just increase that slider. So it's a little more dense. We can adjust this accordingly, right? So a lot of kind of cool stuff to do, but we want to now give it that dimension. So we'll zoom in a little more back to that. So what we want to do now is I don't really have to worry about it being grafted and everything being kind of treated in their own respective pool of data. So I'm going to go ahead and flatten this. And now from here, I want to begin to offset our curve. So if I just go and type offset, you're going to see that I need a lot of information. I have the curve, but I want to make sure I use a specific distance, an actual plane. So the plane is what's most important. You can see if I just drag that in there, it's kind of got them going in all sorts of different directions. So we want to make sure we use the correct plane. And that's going to be useful for both the offsetting and the extrusion part of this to give it that thickness. So I'm going to go ahead and take this curve. I'm going to just do a simple point on curve and use the curve closest point to get some of those parameters. So there's the curve, here's the point I need. Like I said, this gives us our parameter to get that information. So I'm going to go to analysis and I'm going to use the curve frame. We'll drag that into there and this into there. And you can start to see that frame for these next couple steps. So in order to offset it, we need to know which direction. And while looking at this, we have the red or the X going in the up, so that's not what we need. But we do have that green, which is what we do need for those other things. But luckily, we can just go ahead and drag this into our plane. I'm going to turn this stuff off because we don't really need to see it. And now you'll see that all our offset curves are going in the correct direction, which is great. And now we can determine how far we want. So we can do 0.5 less than 1.5. So now we can kind of play around with how thick we want that offset to be. Like I said, I'm going to keep it somewhat thinner for now. And now I can take these two curves and create a surface from that. So I'll just go to surface and use the ruled surface. So there's the interior curve and our exterior. So, oops, and I'm not sure why it offsets that, which is kind of annoying, or graphs it, but I'm just going to go ahead and flatten that. That'll solve that issue. So you might want to remember to do that before you just plug that in, because it could create some issues for your computer. But you can see now we've got an actual surface, but again, it's just a undefined thickness, so we want to extrude those. So I'm going to do extrude. And again, this is what's important because we want to make sure that we use a specific direction So that's what, again, our horizontal frame is. So if I turn that on, we want that to go. Using this frame, we want to use the z-axis to give it that thickness. So now I can go to vector, deconstruct, and I'm, like I said, I'm going to use my z value, but I don't want to just use that one because then it's just going to give me a fixed thickness. So I want to actually go to vector and give that direction, that z-axis, an amplitude. Oops. And I'll drag that in here, and now I can actually use this to determine my thickness. So I'll do something like 0.25. So now you'll see that we can use that to control the thickness of our ribs. So 0.25. Depending on what material is, you might be limited to that thickness. I'm going to go ahead, because I do want it to kind of get as close to perpendicular as possible over there, and unfortunately it doesn't work exactly with 360, but I'm going to bump this up to 355. Just increase that a little bit more. So that's a little better. Pretty happy with that. So now we can start to apply those other elements, such as our floor and cross beams to give it a little more structure. Again, you can play with those in all sorts of different ways. But from here, I'm going to, again, kind of use these points as my starting point. So I'm going to go ahead and go to Sets, List Item, and this will actually allow me to kind of determine which plane of my structure to do our floor. So if I do, again, I've got 30 of these, so if I just stick with a slider between 0 and 30, you'll start to see that this kind of allows me to dictate the height in which I want to do my floor at, because it's just picking basically that level. And so from here, I can take my points, create another curve from that. So again, I'm going to use the interpolated curve. Oops, so for some reason it doesn't like it that way because it's trying to still create points in the other direction. So if I go to Sets, Tree, flip the matrix, and drag that into there, now I'll have a curve that's connecting, because basically each one of these are in their own separate tool set or separate data set. So we need to flip it to kind of group them all together. You can kind of see that there's one point in each branch. Now there's, in this case, it basically flattens it or puts them all in the same data pool. And so kind of similar to what we've already done, I'm going to offset this. I don't have to worry too much about the plane because it is just going to be on the XY. So I'll just do this. And I will use a negative value. So I'm going to use something like -10 less than -2. And now we can see, depending on how far, we can obviously adjust that. So it probably doesn't want to go out too far. Like we know, this kind of helps understand it. We know that our distance goes out 5. So we don't want to really kind of go out much more than that. Or I guess we can, but we do want to kind of keep them similar. And so again, I'll take these. And unfortunately, again, oh, well, this is nice. It doesn't graph it this time. So we will take these two. Again, use the ruled surface. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab it from up here. So now we got that plane. Maybe we do kind of adjust this a little bit more so it's a little bit thicker. There we go. Like I said, even like at 350, it's a little bit better, but or 355, but you'll see if I try to drag this all the way up a little bit higher, it doesn't exactly match up perfectly. I mean, maybe it does this time, I'm not sure. if I get all the way up to 350, oh, so for some reason it worked this time. It didn't before. But it's pretty nice that way. Um, I might have had something kind of off or different numbers, and that's maybe why it did it. But that's good to know that that works now. So now we have kind of a nice enclosed area. There's still kind of some weird things that you might want to have to do, but that's again kind of using an offset that's using multiple distances, and you obviously can do that. There's a special plugin just to do that. It's in one of my plugins, but I'm not going to worry too much about it. But it can be done if you want those to actually kind of meet. So from here again, I'm going to go ahead and extrude my surface. And in this case, because I have it kind of sitting on top, I want it to actually kind of intersect a little bit. So I'm going to do it in the negative z direction. So I'll do something like, again, negative 2.0 less than 0. Probably don't need it to obviously go that thick, but we do want it to kind of intersect so it can be inserted into that. So again, like there's obviously more structure that's going to be needed, but this at least gives us that plane for it to sit on. So there is our floor. So the last thing I'll cover is just that cross beam. So again, it has a little more structure to it. So let's try that. There's something as I'm just thinking about maybe trying as well, which is always kind of fun, is that the end product for the video is sometimes different than the one that I initially showed. But anyway, so I'm going to again take this and copy and paste it. And again, I don't need to have it that far as an offset. So in this case, I'm going to do something like negative 2.0 less than 0.00, I guess, just so I have multiple dimension or multiple decimals. I'll go ahead and drag that into there. I'll make this much thinner. You'll see it's still at that same ground plane, but that's where I'll change it over here. So I can actually have, again, multiple of these. So I'm going to stick with something like 18. I'm going to copy and paste it and just insert another one that's a little bit higher. And then I'll do one that's also lower, but again, I'm not having to repeat all this since it's going to be the same thing. But I can just have multiple of these cross beams. This one will be lower in this case. Awesome. So there you go. So like I said, this kind of gets us to what that end product was. Like I said, I'm going to adjust something just to show you some other iterations. So maybe again, you don't want this to kind of get wider. Maybe you just want to stay at the same distance. In that case, which is nice, all you have to do is I'm going to go ahead and take these though, and instead of multiplying it by that, I'm just going to multiply it by 1 over here. And now you can see that it's nice and enclosed. It doesn't change widths or anything, which is nice. If you wanted to not wrap all the way around, then you can just reduce it to being less than that. So if you wanted to just go like halfway, you can always do it like that. If you want there to be less of those, you can always decrease this. So that's something I want to kind of go to too. But like I said, it's pretty simple to do that. I'm going to go ahead and again use this multiplier. I'm going to go ahead and again bump that all the way up to, let's make sure that's all the way to 359. So that's technically 360 since it does include 0. But we can see that these are much wider, and maybe I'll just add a couple more.